A former general seeking peace in the South American jungle is mistaken for a wealthy magnate and kidnapped by a ruthless cartel. But as he plots his escape, he uncovers a secret that could bring down the entire empire, if he can survive long enough to use it. Alexander Kane leaned back against the cracked leather seat of the rickety bus, the smell of dust and diesel heavy in the air. The landscape outside was a patchwork of rugged hills and dense jungle, a place he had chosen for its isolation, far from the chaos of his former life. But peace, it seemed, was always just out of reach. The bus jolted to a stop on the uneven dirt road, the engine wheezing like an asthmatic smoker. Before Kane could glance at his watch, a shout pierced the humid air. Men emerged from the trees, rifles slung casually but with an unmistakable edge of menace. The other passengers froze, their faces pale with fear. Kane didn't move. His gray eyes flicked over the scene, cataloging details with the precision of years spent in combat. The leader barked orders in Spanish, his voice sharp and commanding. Kane caught snatches of their conversation, cartel talk, demands for identification, money. But when the leader's eyes landed on him, they lit up with an unsettling glint. "Este es el gringo rico," the man sneered. The rich foreigner. The assumption was absurd, but Kane didn't argue. Years of military service had taught him the value of playing along when outnumbered and outgunned. With deliberate calm, he raised his hands and allowed himself to be dragged off the bus, his mind already working through potential escape routes. The humid jungle enveloped them as Kane was forced along a narrow trail, his wrists bound tightly with coarse rope. The cartel soldiers surrounded him, their chatter a mix of bravado and wariness. He kept his expression neutral, masking the simmering calculation behind his eyes. The journey ended at a remote clearing dominated by a weathered hacienda, its once a grand facade marred by years of neglect. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter, their movements relaxed but not careless. This was a stronghold, but not an impenetrable one. Kane's gaze swept the area, noting potential vulnerabilities. The loose latticework on a second-story window, the uneven patrol patterns. Inside, he was shoved into a sparsely furnished room with barred windows, his captors left without a word, slamming the heavy door behind them. Kane sat on the creaking wooden chair, the room's damp air pressing down on him. He replayed the events leading to his capture. A retired general seeking solace in the anonymity of the jungle, mistaken for someone wealthy and influential. It was laughable, but the cartel's error might also be his opportunity. These men were professionals, but they were also arrogant, a trait he could exploit. Hours later, the door creaked open. A man entered, his presence commanding but understated. Antonio El Lobo Vargas was lean and wolf-like, his dark eyes scanning Kane with predatory curiosity. He said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch like a taut wire. "You don't look scared," Vargas finally said, his English fluent and tinged with a faint accent. "Interesting," Kane shrugged. "Should I be?" The cartel leader smirked. "That depends. What does a man like you value most? Money? Power? Family?" He leaned closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "Everyone has something." Kane didn't flinch, meeting Vargas's gaze with a calm that was more unnerving than defiance. "You've made a mistake," he said evenly. "I'm not who you think I am." Vargas chuckled. "Perhaps, but even mistakes can be useful." He straightened, signaling to his men. "We'll see how useful you are." As the door closed again, Kane allowed a small, grim smile. Vargas's mistake might cost him more than he realized. For now, Kane would observe and wait. Patience was a weapon, and Kane was well armed. The room was small, with a single barred window that let in a sliver of moonlight, casting long, thin shadows across the cracked concrete walls. Kane sat motionless in the corner, his muscles coiled with a soldier's patience. The cartel's compound bustled beyond the walls, muffled voices, the scrape of boots on gravel, the distant hum of generators. He listened, absorbing everything. It had been 3 days since his capture, and in that time, Kane had begun to piece together the cartel's operations. The guards rotated in predictable shifts, their discipline lax. Supplies were brought in through a back entrance, and several outbuildings suggested a variety of illicit enterprises beyond drugs, perhaps human trafficking or illegal arms. He filed each observation away, building a mental blueprint of his prison. His first real contact with the outside world came when a woman entered the room. She carried a tray of food, nothing more than rice, and a few scraps of meat. Kane studied her with quiet interest. She moved with practiced efficiency, but her eyes, dark and wary, flicked toward the door as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment. "Sofia Morales," he said, testing the name he had overheard from passing guards. She froze, her gaze snapping to his, but she quickly recovered, setting the tray down and turning to leave. "I know you're not here by choice," Kane continued, his voice low, non-threatening. "Neither am I." Sofia hesitated at the door, her fingers gripping the handle tightly. "You should eat," she murmured without looking at him, before slipping out and locking the door behind her. Kane allowed himself a small smile. The first step was always establishing rapport, and he had just planted the seed. He would need Sofia's help. She was clearly trusted enough to move freely within the compound, and more importantly, she might know things he couldn't observe from his cell. Through the narrow window, Kane could see the compound's main courtyard. Men sat around makeshift tables, gambling, drinking, laughing too loudly. There was a casual arrogance in their demeanor, the kind that came from thinking they were untouchable. A mistake, Kane thought grimly. He watched as Diego, Vargas's right-hand man, strode across the courtyard with a purpose that the others lacked. Tall and broad-shouldered, Diego exuded an air of barely restrained violence, the kind that Kane had seen too many times before in war zones across the world. Kane knew he'd have to watch him closely. By nightfall, Kane had finished his meager meal and lay stretched on the cot, his mind cataloging patterns, the way the guards' footsteps echoed down the hall, the scent of gasoline drifting through the window, the distant sound of vehicles coming and going. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a hub of operations, and that meant vulnerabilities. Sofia returned the next morning, this time with fresh water. Kane didn't speak, merely nodded in acknowledgement. She lingered a second longer than before. "I heard them talking," she said quietly, not meeting his gaze. "They think you're rich, important." Kane allowed himself a soft chuckle. "I'm neither." "Then why are you so calm?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. He met her gaze, his expression steady. "Because I know how this ends." Sofia studied him for a long moment, then shook her head and left. Kane watched her go, satisfied. She was curious now, and curiosity was the first step toward trust. As the compound settled into another day of routine, Kane continued to observe. He knew time was his greatest weapon, and patience his strongest ally. A plan was forming, slowly but surely, and when the opportunity came, he would be ready. The flickering bulb above Kane's cot buzzed intermittently, casting erratic shadows on the cold walls of his cell. He sat on the edge of the cot, his fingers tracing the rough surface of his wrist bindings, mind drifting between the present and the past. The Cartels compound had a familiar rhythm, the same tension, the same uneasy undercurrent of violence that once filled his military deployments. Some things never changed. He could almost hear the echoes of shouted commands, the deafening roar of gunfire, the acrid sting of smoke in his lungs. Afghanistan, Iraq, places where order and chaos intertwined. It was in those war zones that he had learned to survive, to read a situation in seconds and act without hesitation. Those lessons were serving him well now. A voice from outside the cell door brought him back to the present. "You're too calm for a man in your position," said Diego, his voice low and laced with suspicion. Kane didn't turn, keeping his breathing steady. "Maybe I'm just not impressed," he replied, his tone even. Diego chuckled, but it was humorless. "El Lobo is watching you. He doesn't trust men who don't show fear." Kane finally looked up, his gray eyes locking onto Diego's dark ones through the bars. "Fear's a waste of energy." The cartel lieutenant studied him for a long moment before scoffing and walking away. Kane watched his retreating figure with quiet calculation. Diego was sharp, sharper than most of the men here. That made him dangerous. Kane would have to tread carefully. As the footsteps faded, Kane let out a slow breath. The memories pressed in again, unbidden but persistent. He remembered his last mission, the one that had finally convinced him to leave it all behind. The faces of men who had trusted him, the weight of choices that haunted him even now. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers. Combat had left its mark on him, deeper than scars or wounds. It had shaped him into someone who could sit in the heart of an enemy's stronghold without breaking a sweat. But it had also left him hollow in places he didn't like to think about. Sofia's hesitant knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. She entered with her usual cautious steps, setting a plate down without a word. But today she lingered. "You were a soldier," she said finally. Not quite a question, but more of an observation. Cain glanced at her, weighing his response. "I was." Her eyes narrowed. "Not anymore?" He smiled faintly. "Not officially." Sophia studied him, then nodded as if she understood something unsaid. "The men here, they think you're someone important, someone with money." "They're wrong," Cain said, his tone dry. "But I'll let them believe it." She hesitated, glancing at the door. "Why?" "Because it buys me time." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. She was smart, no doubt about it. Smart enough to know he was planning something, but wary enough to keep her distance. Before she could leave, Cain spoke again. "You don't belong here, Sophia." Her eyes darkened. "Neither do you." And with that, she slipped out the door. Cain leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. He knew the clock was ticking. The more time he spent here, the more likely Vargas would see through his act. He needed to move, but not yet. He had to know more, find the right opportunity, the right weakness. The echoes of his past whispered in his mind again. Patience, precision, control. And when the moment came, he would be ready. Days passed in a slow, calculated rhythm. Cain maintained his usual demeanor, calm, observant, unshaken. He had learned long ago that survival was a game of patience, and in this place, patience was his greatest ally. But now his focus shifted toward the one person who might offer a way out. Sophia Morales. She came every day bringing food and water, her presence marked by a quiet hesitance. Cain watched her, not with suspicion, but with interest. She moved with a practiced ease that spoke of experience, yet her eyes betrayed something else, something trapped. She was not one of them, and he could see the weight of that realization gnawing at her. One evening, as she placed the tray down, Cain spoke without looking up. "Why do you stay?" Sophia froze for a heartbeat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray. "I don't have a choice," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "There's always a choice," Cain replied, leaning forward slightly. "You just have to know when to take it." She glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone, then whispered, "You don't understand how things work here." Cain smiled faintly. "Try me." For a moment, Sophia said nothing. Then she sighed, sitting on the edge of the rickety chair in the corner, her eyes darting nervously. "I was taken, not like you, but I owe them." She looked down at her hands. "My brother. He got involved in things he shouldn't have, and I had to make a deal." Cain studied her carefully. "And now you're stuck." She nodded, biting her lip. "They don't let people leave." Cain let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Maybe they don't have to." Sophia looked at him sharply, suspicion flickering in her gaze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Cain said slowly, "that I need information, and you might want something in return." Her expression hardened. "I don't trust you." Cain leaned back, unbothered. "You don't have to, but if you want out of this, you're going to need me as much as I need you." Sophia stood abruptly, shaking her head. "You don't know what they're capable of." "I know exactly what they're capable of," Cain said, his voice low, steady. "I've seen men like Vargas before." He met her gaze. "I know how to stop them." For a long moment, Sophia lingered at the door, uncertainty written across her face. Then without another word, she slipped away, leaving Cain alone with his thoughts. He exhaled slowly. The seed had been planted, but trust was a fragile thing, and Sophia was still balancing on the edge of doubt and fear. Cain knew he couldn't push too hard, too fast. He needed her to come to him on her own terms. As the compound buzzed outside his cell, Cain turned his thoughts back to the structural weaknesses he had observed. The guards' rotations, the blind spots in their patrols, the poorly secured supply routes. All of it painted a picture of vulnerability. If he could gather more intel from Sophia, the pieces of his escape would start falling into place. Late that night, when the compound had quieted, Cain heard soft footsteps outside his door. Sophia's voice came in a whisper through the bars. "There's something you should know," she said, hesitation thick in her tone. "The shipments. There's one coming tomorrow night. It's bigger than usual." Cain nodded, processing the information. "Thank you." A pause. "Don't thank me yet," she murmured, and then she was gone. Cain closed his eyes, a small smile forming. The fragile link was forming, and soon it would be strong enough to pull. The tension in the compound had begun to shift, a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent that Kane could sense in every interaction, every glance thrown his way. He had spent enough time in war zones to know when paranoia was seeping into the ranks. It was only a matter of time before someone snapped. Antonio El Lobo Vargas, the cartel's enigmatic leader, had become increasingly watchful. His once aloof demeanor had shifted, and Kane could feel his scrutiny like a predator circling wounded prey. Kane knew Vargas was beginning to question him, not openly, not yet, but the way his dark eyes lingered too long, the way his questions came laced with suspicion. It was clear that the facade was beginning to crack. Late one afternoon, Kane was hauled from his cell and escorted to the central courtyard, where Vargas awaited him under the shade of a makeshift canopy. A few cartel enforcers lounged nearby, watching with thinly veiled curiosity. Vargas smiled, a sharp, wolfish grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You've been quiet, Senor Kane, too quiet." Kane shrugged, keeping his tone measured. "Not much to say." Vargas chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Men like you usually talk when they're afraid." Kane met his gaze without flinching. "I've learned fear doesn't change outcomes. Actions do." For a moment, Vargas simply stared, his fingers drumming lazily against the table in front of him. Then, without warning, he leaned forward. "Who are you, really?" Kane allowed a small smile. "Just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time." Vargas studied him for a long beat before laughing, though Kane could see the frustration creeping in. "Maybe, but I have a feeling there's more to you, my friend. I don't like mysteries." Kane said nothing, letting the silence do the work. He knew Vargas was trying to probe, to push him into revealing something, anything, that could confirm the suspicions brewing in his mind. But Kane had spent a lifetime mastering the art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. After a tense pause, Vargas waved a hand dismissively. "Back to your cell." As Kane was led away, he could feel the weight of Diego's stare boring into his back. The lieutenant had grown increasingly wary, and Kane knew it was only a matter of time before Diego's suspicions turned to action. He needed to move before that happened. Back in his cell, Kane sat on the edge of the cot, deep in thought. He knew he had to accelerate his plans. The cartel's internal stability was starting to crack, small fractures, but enough to exploit. He had already begun sowing seeds of discord among the lower ranks, whispering carefully chosen words to guards when no one else was listening, planting doubts about loyalty and leadership. It didn't take much. Fear and greed were powerful motivators, and Kane had long ago learned how to weaponize both. That night, Sophia returned, slipping into his cell with an urgency he hadn't seen before. Her eyes darted nervously toward the hallway. "Vargas is getting impatient," she whispered. "He doesn't believe you anymore." Kane nodded. "I expected that." She hesitated, then said, "They're planning something. Diego, he thinks you're a threat. He's watching me too." Kane's jaw tightened. He had hoped for more time, but time was a luxury he no longer had. "We move soon," he said quietly. Sophia's expression hardened. "I'm not ready." "You'll never be ready," Kane said gently. "But the longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." She swallowed hard, then nodded. "What do you need?" Kane leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. "Access to the supply routes, the armory schedules, and the guard rotations. Can you get that?" Sophia's lips pressed together. "I'll try." As she slipped out, Kane exhaled slowly. The cracks were widening, and it was only a matter of time before the whole structure came crumbling down. He just had to make sure he was ready when it did. The air in the compound had grown heavier, thick with suspicion and unspoken tension. Kane could feel it in the way the guards carried themselves, their eyes lingering a second too long, their hands resting on their weapons with newfound readiness. Vargas's paranoia was spreading, infecting the ranks like a slow poison. Sophia's visits had become shorter, more cautious. She moved through the compound like a ghost, slipping information to Kane in brief exchanges, her voice hushed and trembling at the edges. But tonight, something was different. She arrived after midnight, her steps hurried but deliberate. As she entered Kane's dimly lit cell, he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly, clutching a folded scrap of paper. "I got it," she whispered, handing it to him. "The supply route schedules, the armory shifts, it's all here." Kane took the paper without hesitation, his eyes scanning the hastily scribbled notes. Supply trucks coming in every 3 days, lightly guarded. The armory, surprisingly lax in its security during the early morning shifts. A shipment heading out in less than 48 hours, an opportunity he couldn't afford to miss. "You did good," Kane murmured, folding the paper and slipping it into his boot. Sophia swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the door. "We need to be careful. Diego, he's watching everyone now. He suspects me." Kane nodded, his mind already working through contingencies. "Then we move fast. We use the next supply run to slip out." Sophia hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. "And if we get caught?" Kane's voice was calm, but firm. "We won't." Despite his reassurance, Kane knew their margin for error was razor thin. Vargas was too smart to let him slip through his fingers easily. But then, as Sophia turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, drawing closer. Her eyes widened in alarm, and Kane gestured for her to stay quiet. He moved swiftly, pulling her toward the shadows beside the cot, just as Diego's voice rang out. "I know you're up, Kane." Diego's voice came from the other side of the door, thick with suspicion. "I can feel it. You're planning something." Kane kept a firm grip on Sophia's wrist, feeling the slight tremor in her pulse. He remained silent, his mind racing. "I see everything," Diego continued, his voice laced with a dark amusement. "And soon, so will El Lobo." After a long, tense moment, the footsteps retreated. Sophia exhaled shakily, stepping back into the dim light. "He's not going to stop." "I know," Kane said grimly. "That's why we make our move before he does." The next morning, the compound was alive with activity. Kane watched from his cell as men loaded crates into the trucks, their movements hurried and distracted. He could already see the gaps in their security, the blind spots in their patrols. But just as he began to formulate the final details of their escape, his instinct screamed at him. Something was wrong. The guards were tense, their conversations clipped. He overheard snippets of talk. Vargas was planning something big, something beyond the borders of this remote outpost. Sophia returned with confirmation later that evening, her eyes wide with fear. "They're expanding," she whispered urgently. "Vargas, he's moving operations north. More weapons, more men. He's making a power play." Kane's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. If Vargas's expansion succeeded, it would plunge entire regions into chaos. He couldn't let that happen. Sophia looked at him, uncertainty in her eyes. "What now?" Kane's mind raced through the possibilities. "We stick to the plan," he said after a moment. "But we don't just escape, we shut them down." Sophia blinked. "You're insane." "Maybe," Kane admitted. "But it's the only way to stop them." She stared at him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "I hope you know what you're doing." Kane allowed himself a grim smile. "So do I." With the crucial information now in hand and the stakes higher than ever, Kane knew the next 48 hours would determine everything. The time for observation was over. Now it was time to act. The jungle night was alive with the chirping of insects and the rustle of leaves, masking the quiet tension building inside the compound. Kane crouched in the shadows just beyond the armory, his pulse steady, his mind focused. Tonight was the night. There was no turning back. Sophia was beside him, her breathing shallow but controlled. She had proven herself in the last 48 hours, slipping him key details that allowed him to exploit the cartel's vulnerabilities. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of determination that hadn't been there before. "You ready?" he whispered. She nodded, clutching the small knife he had given her earlier. "Let's get this over with." Kane scanned the compound one last time, noting the gaps in the patrols and the distracted guards by the main gates. The supply trucks were already loaded and waiting for departure. He had planted small disturbances throughout the day, misplaced inventory, tampered fuel lines, and whispered doubts among the men. Confusion was his weapon now. With a nod to Sophia, they moved. Kane slipped through the darkness, keeping low and using the stacked crates for cover. A guard stood by the armory entrance, his cigarette glowing in the dim light. Kane struck fast and silent, his arm locking around the man's neck, cutting off his air before he could make a sound. He eased the unconscious body to the ground and motioned for Sophia to follow. Inside, the armory was cluttered but poorly organized. Kane grabbed a sidearm, checking the magazine before tucking it into his waistband. He passed Sophia a smaller handgun, her hands trembling as she took it. "Just point and shoot if you have to," he said. They moved quickly, placing small explosive charges along the key structural points of the compound. Kane knew the noise alone would create enough panic to allow them to slip out unnoticed, but they wouldn't leave quietly. Vargas's empire needed to burn from the inside out. The first explosion shook the compound like a thunderclap. Alarms blared to life, and shouting erupted from all directions. In the chaos, Kane and Sophia slipped through the confusion, sticking to the blind spots Kane had carefully noted over the past days. Gunfire erupted as cartel members scrambled to secure the perimeter, unaware that the real threat was already within their walls. Kane used the chaos to his advantage, taking down isolated guards swiftly and silently. They were halfway to the supply trucks when Diego's voice rang out across the courtyard. "Find him! El Lobo wants him alive!" Kane cursed under his breath. Time was running out. He grabbed Sophia's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the compound where the jungle met the clearing. "We go now," he said, his voice firm. They sprinted across the open ground, bullets kicking up dirt behind them. Kane took down a pursuing guard with a precise shot, the years of military experience manifesting in controlled, efficient movement. Sophia stumbled but kept moving, her face pale but resolute. The trees loomed ahead, a sanctuary of darkness and cover. Kane turned back, firing a few more shots to cover their retreat before plunging into the dense undergrowth. The jungle swallowed them whole, but they weren't safe yet. Behind them, the compound burned, smoke curling into the night sky. Vargas wouldn't let this go unanswered. They had wounded the beast, but it wasn't dead yet. Sophia leaned against a tree, catching her breath. "We did it," she said between ragged gasps. Kane's expression remained grim. Not yet. He could hear voices in the distance, the cartel's men already spreading into the jungle. They needed to keep moving and fast. "Come on," he said, helping her to her feet. "This isn't over." With the jungle as their cover and Vargas's men hot on their trail, Kane knew the final confrontation was approaching. The insurrection had begun, but the war was far from won. The thick jungle canopy provided Kane and Sophia with temporary refuge, but the cartel's men were relentless. Flashlights flickered in the distance, cutting through the darkness like hungry predators. The humid air clung to them, the sounds of pursuit drawing closer. Kane moved with calculated precision, guiding Sophia through the dense foliage while keeping his senses on high alert. "We have to keep moving," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant shouts. Sophia nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "How much further?" "Not far," Kane replied. He had memorized the terrain from the compound's layout, pinpointing a supply cache hidden deeper in the jungle. If they could reach it, they'd have weapons, supplies, and a chance to strike back. A burst of gunfire echoed through the trees, forcing them to drop to the ground. Kane pressed his ear to the earth, listening carefully. The cartel's search party was closing in. "We're running out of time," Sophia murmured. Kane scanned their surroundings. "We split up," he said firmly. "I'll draw them away. You keep heading east. There's an old outpost there. Wait for me." Sophia's eyes widened in protest. "No, I'm not leaving you." Kane's gaze was steady. "You need to trust me. We'll meet there." She hesitated but nodded reluctantly. With a final glance, she slipped away into the undergrowth. Kane waited a beat before rising and moving in the opposite direction, deliberately snapping branches and leaving a trail designed to lure their pursuers. It worked. Within minutes, shouts erupted as the cartel's men followed the false path, leaving Sophia's escape unnoticed. Kane kept moving, his mind already planning the next step. By the time he reached the outpost, dawn was breaking. Sophia was waiting, tension etched into her features. I'm fine," Kane interrupted. "But we need to move fast." Inside the outpost, Kane found what he was looking for, an old radio transmitter. Static filled the room as he adjusted the dials, finally locking onto a frequency. "This is Kane," he said, his voice steady. "I need an extraction. Coordinates inbound." A pause, then a crackled response. "Copy that, Kane. Extraction in T-minus 40 minutes. Sophia looked at him with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You had a backup plan?" Kane smirked. "I always do." But their reprieve was short-lived. Through the thin walls of the outpost, they could hear the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. Vargas wasn't letting them go without a fight. Kane's expression hardened. "We have to hold them off until extraction." They fortified their position, turning overturned furniture into barricades and placing their newly acquired weapons within reach. Sophia loaded her pistol with a newfound steadiness in her hands. The first wave hit fast and hard, Bullets tore through the walls as Kane returned fire with practiced efficiency, taking down enemies with precision. Sophia held her ground, picking her shots carefully, her fear replaced by focused determination. Between volleys, Kane spotted Diego coordinating the assault from a nearby hill, barking orders into a radio. Kane knew this was the moment. If he could take Diego out, it would cripple their pursuit. "Sophia, cover me," he ordered, grabbing a rifle and slipping out the back. Creeping through the undergrowth, he flanked Diego's position. The lieutenant never saw him coming. Kane's knife flashed, and within moments, Diego was down, his radio clattering to the ground. Returning to the outpost, Kane found Sophia holding her own. The cartel forces scattered without Diego's leadership. The sound of approaching helicopters signaled their salvation. "Time to go!" Kane shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand as they dashed toward the clearing. The choppers descended, gunfire erupting as cover fire rained down from above. Kane helped Sophia climb aboard, turning one last time to see the cartel compound burning in the distance. As they lifted off, Sophia looked at him, a mixture of exhaustion and relief in her eyes. "It's over." Kane's expression remained unreadable. Not yet. He knew Vargas was still out there. The battle had been won, but the war was far from finished. The rhythmic thrum of the helicopter blades faded into the distance as Kane and Sophia touched down in a remote clearing far from the cartel's reach. For now. The adrenaline still coursed through their veins, but Kane knew it was a temporary reprieve. Vargas wouldn't let this go unanswered. Kane stepped out first, scanning their surroundings. A small, abandoned airstrip stretched before them, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by time. Their contact, an old associate of Kane's, was waiting by a rusted hangar, his silhouette barely visible in the early dawn light. "You're late," the man said, his voice rough. "Traffic," Kane replied dryly. The contact, a former intelligence officer named Reynolds, gestured toward a nearby table covered with maps and documents. "You stirred up a hornet's nest, Kane. Vargas is already moving reinforcements south. He's cutting off all routes out of this region." Sophia, standing beside Kane, crossed her arms. "So we just sit here and wait to be hunted?" Kane shook his head. "No, we take the fight to him." Reynolds arched an eyebrow. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and frankly, running on fumes. What's your plan, old man?" Kane studied the map, his eyes tracing the lines of cartel movement. He pointed to a secluded river crossing, one of the few vulnerabilities left unguarded. "We hit them here, cut off their supplies, take out Vargas's key men, and force him into the open." Sophia stared at him. "You're talking about starting a war." "It already started," Kane said. "Now we finish it." Reynolds sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I can get you some hardware, a few explosives, maybe an RPG if you're lucky. But you'll be on your own out there." Kane nodded. "That's all I need." As the night fell over the airstrip, Kane sat alone with his thoughts. The weight of years in combat settled on his shoulders, like an old burden he could never quite put down. He knew what had to be done. Vargas was more than just a cartel boss. He was a symbol of corruption and violence that stretched beyond this jungle. And Kane had made it his mission to end that reign, whatever the cost. Sophia approached, her expression unreadable. "What happens after?" Kane didn't answer right away. He stared out at the darkened jungle, the faint glow of distant fires marking the remnants of the cartel compound they had left behind. "You start over," he finally said. "Find a life beyond this." "And you?" she asked. Kane gave a small, tired smile. "I don't think starting over is in the cards for me." She didn't argue, but the concern in her eyes was clear. "Just don't get yourself killed," she said, turning to walk away. "Not planning on it," Kane murmured under his breath, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. By dawn, their team was in place. A small but efficient group of fighters, hardened by past battles and driven by a common enemy. Kane stood at the front, rifle in hand, eyes locked on the distant river crossing where Vargas's men would soon arrive. The first cartel vehicles rumbled into view, a convoy of armed trucks loaded with supplies and reinforcements. Kane gave the signal, and the first explosive detonated, engulfing the lead truck in flames. Chaos erupted as gunfire split the air, shouts of panic filling the valley. Kane moved like a ghost through the battlefield, his every shot precise, every movement calculated. Sophia covered his flank, proving herself more capable than he had expected. Then came the moment Kane had been waiting for, Vargas's personal convoy. As the armored SUV rolled into sight, Cain took his shot, the bullet puncturing a tire and sending the vehicle skidding into a ditch. Vargas stumbled out, disoriented, but alive. Cain advanced, his rifle trained on the man who had caused so much destruction. Vargas smirked despite his situation. "I should have killed you when I had the chance." Cain pressed the barrel against Vargas's chest. "You never had a chance." A gunshot rang out, but it wasn't Cain's. Sophia stood behind him, her pistol aimed steadily at Vargas's fallen body. She exhaled slowly, lowering her weapon. "It's over," she whispered. Cain looked at Vargas's lifeless form and nodded. "Yeah, it is." The jungle was silent now, the war finally over. But Cain knew his battle would never truly end. As they made their way back to the airstrip, Sophia looked at him one last time. "So what now?" Cain glanced at the rising sun. "Now, we clean up the mess." The dust had barely settled, but Cain knew the fight was far from over. As he stood by the airstrip, watching the remnants of Vargas's cartel crumble under the weight of their losses, he felt a familiar emptiness creeping in. Victory had come at a cost, as it always did. Sophia packed her belongings, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I'm going back to rebuild," she said softly. "No more running." Cain nodded. "You'll do good." Authorities arrived soon after, sweeping through the compound ruins with precision. Cain had given them everything: routes, contacts, operations. The cartel's grip was shattered, and that was enough, for now. As Sophia left, Cain lingered, staring at the jungle beyond. He had no illusions of peace, but perhaps a new purpose. There were other battles, other evils. He adjusted his pack, stepping onto the road. Time to find them. And with that, he walked away. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on the battlefield, but within ourselves. Cain's journey proves that survival isn't just about strength, but about strategy, resilience, and knowing when to fight and when to walk away. In a world full of deception and danger, the choices we make define who we truly are. What would you have done in his place? Would you have fought back, or simply tried to escape? Click the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and uncover more stories that challenge the way you see the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. See.